The moment that keeps replaying in my head is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible, the kind of moment most people would forget before dessert even arrives. My son Caleb reached for the bread basket before I even realized what was happening, pulling it a little closer to his side of the table like he already understood something I was still trying to deny. That small movement, that silent adjustment, felt heavier than anything anyone said that night. He was only 8 years old, but in that second, he looked like someone who had already learned how to make himself smaller to fit into someone else's comfort. We had been invited to dinner by my sister Melanie, and from the moment I walked into that restaurant, I could feel that everything about the night was carefully curated to impress. The lighting was dim in that expensive, intentional way that made every glass of wine look richer and every conversation feel more important than it really was. The tables were spaced far enough apart to make privacy feel like a luxury, and the staff moved with a kind of quiet efficiency that reminded you this was not a place for casual mistakes. Melanie loved places like this. She said they made life feel elevated, like she had finally arrived somewhere she had always imagined herself being. I got there late, rushing in straight from work, still carrying the weight of a long day on my shoulders. Caleb was with me, wearing his baseball hoodie under a jacket I had insisted he put on so he would look presentable. He didn't complain, but I could tell he would have preferred to stay in something more comfortable. As soon as we approached the table, Melanie stood up just enough to give me a quick, distracted hug. She smiled, but her attention was already drifting back to the conversation she had been having before we arrived. She said I made it, but it didn't feel like she had been waiting for me. The table was already full, my parents were there, sitting side by side like they always did at family gatherings, quietly observing everything without ever really stepping in. Melanie's husband Greg was at the head of the table, relaxed in a way that suggested he was finally enjoying a stretch of success after a rough period in his business. A couple of cousins were there, along with some friends of theirs I barely knew. Everyone had drinks in front of them, glasses half full, conversations already in motion. It felt like we were stepping into something that had already been happening for a while, like we were catching up to a moment that didn't pause for us. We sat down, and almost immediately I realized that most of the meal had already been planned. Melanie had taken care of it earlier, coordinating with the waiter so everything would come out smoothly. There was talk of steaks, seafood platters, appetizers that would be shared, and desserts that would arrive later for the entire table. It was all very organized, very intentional. Caleb picked up the kids' menu they had given him and started coloring quietly, his head bent down, staying out of the way kids often do when they sense they are not the center of attention. When the waiter came back to confirm how everyone wanted their steaks cooked, the conversation shifted slightly toward logistics. People were specifying temperatures, adding small preferences, making sure everything would come out exactly how they liked it. That was when Melanie suddenly turned her attention toward Caleb, as if she had just remembered he was there. She paused for a second, then said lightly that they had not ordered anything for him. Her tone made it sound like a minor detail, something easily brushed aside. I waited for her to correct it, to ask the waiter to add something simple for him, but instead she smiled in a way that felt dismissive and said that kids usually just eat bread and fries anyway. Before I could even respond, my father let out a small laugh from across the table and said I should have brought something for him, because places like this were not really designed for children. There was a brief flicker of discomfort among a few people at the table, but no one challenged what had been said. No one stepped in to fix it. Caleb looked at me for a moment, then gave a small shrug, the kind that tries to make everything feel okay even when it isn't. He said he was not that hungry, his voice soft and careful, like he was trying to help me avoid embarrassment. Then he reached for the bread basket, pulling it closer to himself without making a scene. That was the moment that changed everything for me. It was not about the food anymore. It was about what he was learning in that moment, sitting there quietly while the adults around him decided, without saying it directly, that he mattered a little less. For years, I had ignored smaller things when it came to Melanie. Comments that felt like jokes but carried a sharp edge underneath. Little remarks about my apartment after my divorce, about the truck I still drove, about how I was still figuring things out. She would say it in a way that sounded light, but it always left a mark. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. I told myself keeping the peace mattered more. But sitting there, watching my son adjust himself to fit into someone else's version of what was acceptable, I realized that those small moments had been building toward something much bigger. The waiter returned with another bottle of wine, and that was when I stood up, I didn't raise my voice or make a dramatic gesture. I simply shifted enough to get everyone's attention and said calmly that I would like to separate my check and Caleb's from the rest of the table. The waiter nodded, used to these kinds of requests, and started to note it down. Then I added something that changed the entire atmosphere at the table. I mentioned that I would also need to cancel my portion of the lake house payment before the deadline the next day. The conversation stopped almost instantly. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like it has weight in the air. Melanie looked at me, confused at first, then slightly alarmed. She asked what I was talking about, her voice tight. I explained, still calm, that I had covered part of the deposit for the summer house the month before. Most of the people at the table had no idea what I was referring to. They looked between us, trying to piece together information they had never been given. Greg leaned forward, surprised, asking if I had really paid part of the deposit. My father frowned, clearly under the impression that Greg had handled it entirely. Greg suddenly seemed very interested in his glass of water, avoiding eye contact. Melanie's expression shifted, becoming more controlled, more careful. She asked me not to do this there, saying I was embarrassing her. That was the moment I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurd it felt. I wasn't exposing anything that wasn't true. I wasn't creating a scene. I was simply choosing not to hide something that had always been there. Months earlier, Melanie had come to me privately, explaining that things were temporarily tight because of delays in Greg's business. She had asked for help, promising to pay me back before summer. I had agreed without hesitation because that's what family does. But sitting there, watching my son eat bread while everyone else enjoyed a carefully planned meal, I realized that my generosity had been quietly taken for granted. I looked at Caleb and asked if he wanted to go somewhere else for dinner. He nodded immediately, too quickly, like he had already been hoping I would say that. That reaction hit me harder than anything else that had happened that night. It meant he had already decided, without saying it out loud, that staying there was not worth it. We left without making a scene, walking out into the cool night air. The noise of the restaurant faded behind us, replaced by a quiet that felt almost unreal after everything that had just happened. Caleb climbed into the truck and sat there for a moment before asking if he had done something wrong. The question caught me off guard, because it revealed exactly how he had interpreted the situation. I told him no, that he had done nothing wrong. Then he asked why they hadn't ordered food for him. It was a simple question, but it carried a weight that was hard to answer honestly without putting something heavy on his shoulders. I took a moment before explaining that sometimes people get too comfortable deciding who matters less, and that it says more about them than it does about us. He didn't respond right away. He just looked out the window, thinking in a way that felt older than his age. Over the next week, the planned family vacation quietly fell apart. Suddenly it was too expensive, too complicated, not the right time. My father called a couple of times, trying to smooth things over without directly addressing what had happened. Melanie sent long messages explaining that it had all been a misunderstanding, that she had been stressed, that I had taken things too personally. But none of it mentioned Caleb, none of it acknowledged the part that mattered most. A month later, I asked Caleb if he wanted to go to another family dinner for a cousin's birthday. He hesitated before answering, then asked if we could just do something on our own instead. There was no anger in his voice, no resentment, just a quiet caution, like he was trying to avoid putting himself in a situation where he might feel that way again. That Saturday, after his baseball game, I took him to a small diner near the highway. It wasn't anything special. The menus were a little sticky, the booths were worn, and the waitress greeted everyone like she had known them for years. But there was something honest about it, something uncomplicated. Caleb ordered a cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake without glancing at the prices or waiting for permission. He just ordered what he wanted, like he felt comfortable again. Halfway through the meal, he started talking about baseball cards, about school, about a joke his friend had made. His voice sounded normal again. Light and unguarded, I sat there listening to him, realizing that what I had thought of as keeping the peace for years had actually been something else entirely. It had been a slow acceptance of small disrespect, a quiet agreement to tolerate things that should have been addressed. That night at the restaurant changed something for me, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood without words. I realized that peace is not always about staying at the table and pretending everything is fine. Sometimes it is about recognizing when a table no longer deserves your presence, and having the courage to stand up and leave, even if it means everything else falls apart afterward.